Well, like Michael, I have written quite a bit about Wallace, about his science, and about his views on spirituality. But today I've actually been asked to, in 20 minutes, to carry the American story of science and spirituality up to today. Now, we've heard a lot about Wallace this morning. And as we've seen, especially in Michael's presentation, that he was able to limit evolution to the lower animals. That is, the animals that weren't human. He would have called them the lower animals. Animals that weren't human, and plants, of course, living things below humans. Now, I believe he did that for social reasons. Because he wasn't conventionally religious, so he wasn't doing it because he was bound to the doctrines of the Genesis account of creation, as some people were then and some people still are today. He always deeply believed that people were special and all people were special. As we've heard, he was a socialist. He was a single taxer. He was a socialist. And he came to those views with passion. Unlike also, and this is a young picture of Wallace, is when he was, of course, as you know, when he was back trouncing around with the native peoples in South America and in the Malay archipelago. And this is a picture of Darwin at the same time. In that respect, he was very different than Darwin. If you read Wallace's accounts, he lived with the native peoples. He listened to them. He participated in their worship services. He felt an affinity toward them. If you read Darwin, he looked down on those people. He considered the Fuegians virtually as low or lower than the apes that he would later watch in the London Zoo. And he was absolutely contemptuous of the native peoples he ran around. He had a hierarchy of the native peoples with the Fuegians at the bottom and the native Australians not much above it. So he didn't have as much at stake in trying to divide humans from the other animals. In these, he saw a continuum through them. Wallace was much different. He had a stake in dividing humans in a major way from all other animals, because he thought all humans had dignity. And that's partly why he was a socialist. And I think that that was a major reason why he, as Michael has pointed out, came up with this idea of overarching intelligence, which would made the human's brain, in all humans, so far above that of all other animals that they could not have come from one another. Now, I make that point actually as preface to trying to explain the situation in ever since, at least in America. But further as way of prologue, we've seen these pictures before. I think Andrew had some of them up. These were pictures from the day, and they captured the way, even at the time, the key issue was human evolution. What always bothered people was human evolution, not evolution in general. Not the evolution of primates, not the evolution, lower primates, or whatever you want to call them, not the evolution of other animals. The problem was always humans. And so you see it in the cartoons of the day. So this is the cartoon that came out right after the expressions of emotions in man and animals. Interestingly, that was originally called the expression of emotions in man and lower animals, but Darwin struck out the lower from that line because he didn't want to view animals as lower, the other animals. And so the cartoon is a woman speaking to Darwin looking like an ape. And it just sort of cut off. I wish it was a little further down, but the line goes something like that. Say what you want about men, but leave me and my emotions out of it. That is, we women are higher than that. And a similar cartoon came out right after the publication of Darwin's Descent of Man, in Punch. I think there's some, yeah, some Punch, obviously. The clue right there at the top. And it's this wonderful scene, sort of the classic scene of the man, in theory, reading from his Bible in front of the fireplace to his wife and his young child. And the caption, if you can't read it there, goes something like this. But instead of reading from the Bible, he's reading from Descent of Man. And so he says, "So you see, Mary, all human beings have descended from hairy quadrupeds with pointed ears and a tail. We all are." And Mary's response is, "Speak for yourself, Jack. I'm not descended from anything of the kind, and baby takes after me." Now, this is the issue. This is what they're fighting about. And this is what an older Wallace cannot stomach, because he's on the side of that people are special, and that people, whether they be Fuegians or whether they be people of New Guinea, deserve dignity, deserve a single tax or whatever. Now, the issue, talking about America, the issue wasn't that bad in America at first, because even while American biologists very quickly accepted the theory of common descent, and in that sense accepted evolution, if by evolution is that species evolved from other species. They did not do so on a natural selection, survival of the fittest sort of mentality. You could look around American biologists of the late 1800s, and you'll find people like Harry Fairfield Osborn or Edward Drinker Cope, and they had other explanations for how evolution happened. Osborn, like many Germans, following from the German tradition, but other Americans believed that we are indwelled with a spirit, a human spirit, that progressively drove evolution forward. And so while we came from earlier lower forms of animals, there was this innate progressive species that moves evolution forward, called orthogenesis. And Cope was a Neo-Lamarckian, a huge school of America of Neo-Lamarckian evolution, which was so American, is the idea that we evolve because, well, just like the giraffe stretching his neck, if it's a dry savanna, we'll get a longer neck. So we will purposely if we will inherit our acquired characteristics. So if we strive to be better, if we pull ourselves up from our bootstraps, those higher boots will go to our descendants, and that's how we evolved. Now, when you think about that, that still leaves humans as special. We have either been further on this inner will, this orthogenesis, this powerful inner will, or we've just worked harder and pulled ourselves up, and so humans can be special. And then, of course, standing over them all was Asa Gray, who was the great botanist from Harvard who had actually worked with Darwin, who developed a rather distinct theory of theistic evolution, that God was behind it, that God was channeling our variation and leading to a higher order of being. And those were the theories of evolution. Even though all of them are evolutionary, those are the theories of evolution that dominated American biology in the years leading up to World War I. And of course, before World War I, we could all believe in progress because thanks to science, we were all moving ahead. Now, World War I pretty well squashed that idea. When you had the greatest scientific powers of the world pounding each other with chemical weapons for no apparent purpose whatsoever, and it broke this theory of progress. You also had the rediscovery about that time, it was a little earlier, it was about 1900, but it didn't sink in for a while, of Mendelian genetics, especially as worked out by this man, probably the most influential biologist of the 20th century, and that is Fisher in England, who worked out the genetical model of evolution that made Darwinism plausible, called the Neo-Darwinian synthesis. It made the Darwinian idea of random mutations, inborn mutations, selected by a survival of the fittest process seem plausible, indeed inevitable to most scientists. And so by the beginning in the 20s and into the 30s, the Darwinian idea becomes, and a strict Darwinian idea, becomes the dominant theory, not only in Europe, but thanks to people like Thomas Hunt Morgan in America, the great geneticist who carried many of these ideas to America, and the people who worked under him, that became the dominant idea in America. Now, this led to the reaction that we all know of in America. Helena High School, one of the evangelists of the day, the hell, of course, being evolution. That these theories of evolution, these theories of materialistic evolution, primarily as applied to humans, are abhorrent to America's way of thinking. And they were picked up by this man, William Jennings Bryan, 3 times nominated by the Democratic Party for president, a great orator, a progressive like Wallace, who could not stomach the idea that humans came from a lower form of animals. He would say things. He was a great speaker. He would give over 200 speeches a year going around the country. He had been Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson and resigned as Secretary of State in protest over the drift toward World War I because he couldn't see the stupidness of this. And he would not tolerate being in the administration that would go to join this war. And he saw in World War I the survival of the fittest Darwinian thinking played out on a massive scale. And he says, we can't be teaching our children that this stuff is right. Because if we teach our children that they descended from a lower primate, then they'll act like monkeys. And he would point out that this is how Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller justified their exploitative labor practices. And there's no one he hated more than John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. And you can't tell these people it's right. And you could no longer soften it, really, with the theistic evolution of Asa Gray, because that wasn't applying anymore. And so he crusaded for laws. Well, he's famous for you, because some of you may have watched Inherit the Wind. He's famous for the Tennessee monkey trial. He tried to defend his law there. He went to Tennessee and got Tennessee to pass that law, and other states, by speaking at the Tennessee legislature. And it wasn't just Tennessee, it was Mississippi, it was Texas, it was Florida, different versions of it. It was restrictions throughout the United States, and he was out there crusading for it, telling them, we don't want our children believing it. But they didn't ban the teaching of evolution. That's what everybody thinks that Scopes was banning from the teaching of evolution. That's not what they said. You could only not teach that humans evolved. He didn't care a twit if everything else evolved. He thought they did, in fact. He believed the earth was very old and said so in Dayton, Tennessee. He said, I don't care whether it's 6,000 years old or 600 million years old. It doesn't matter. What matters is that humans are separately created by God. He didn't even care if it was evolved ape that then was indwelled with a great brain. That shouldn't be taught to our children, or they'll end up shooting each other like the Kaiser did in Germany. This is what he cared about, this famous picture from Huxley's work. And so what happened in America for the next 3 decades is we didn't teach evolution, or we didn't teach human evolution. Because enough states had banned it, enough cities like Columbus, Ohio, or other places throughout the country had banned the teaching of human evolution. Tennessee had said you couldn't put it in the textbooks, that it virtually disappears from the textbooks. Until these guys. Because in America, if we have a critical social problem, who steps in and answers it for us? The Supreme Court. Thank you. Of course, they're going to just give them a chance and they'll get rid of Obamacare yet. So they're going to solve our problems. And this court came in, and this court said that we had to have separation of church and state at the state level, because nobody had ever said that before the 50s. Before the 50s, the First Amendment only applied to the states. So every state could have Bible study in their classes. They could have prayer in the classrooms. They could do whatever they wanted to. They could support a state church if they wanted to. It was perfectly legal, because the First Amendment only applies to the states. Congress shall pass to the federal government. Congress shall pass no law reflecting the establishment of religion or the free exercise thereof. But these guys decided it also applied to the states. I think they did a good job. I agree with them. But that's beside the point. And so what happens is, once the First Amendment also, because at the Scopes trial, even Clarence Darrow, as wily as a lawyer as he was, he couldn't say this law violates the U.S. Constitution, because the U.S. Constitution didn't apply. It didn't defend us. But with this court, the First Amendment now starts applying to the states. And so they strike down Bible reading in class, they strike down prayer in school, and they strike down the old anti-evolution laws. Well, the people who are concerned about human evolution, and by this time they're even more conservative about evolution in general, don't stop there. They says, well, let's come up with a new theory, a new plan. If we cannot ban the teaching of this hellish idea of human evolution, if we now believe in equal time, let's demand equal time for creation science. And so you see, this is Henry Morris and John Whitcomb, and this is their book, Genesis Flood. It came out in 1961. You can still buy it if you go to Christian bookstores. It's still for sale. Last time I checked, it was in the 164th edition. It is the first time that supposedly scientific ideas were marshaled for what they call young earth creationism. The earth was created within the last 10,000 years, directly in 6 days by God's intervention. Before that, most people believed, like St. Augustine to William Jennings Bryan, believed the earth was very old, and all they really were fighting on was that humans were created separately by God. And that's where the Catholic Church has traditionally been, of course. But Henry Morris was a good Baptist, and he brought out his Genesis Flood, and it spread like a whirlwind through the evangelical and fundamentalist subculture and charismatic subculture in America. And starting in the 1970s, states began passing laws, and local cities, local communities, passing school resolutions. Shouldn't limit it to America. A couple Canadian provinces, a couple Australian states too, passed laws mandating equal time or balanced treatment for creation science along with evolution. Again, if you read the debate behind those laws, if you read what's going on in the legislatures when they're talking, what they're saying is, we don't want them to make a monkey out of us. What they really cared about in pushing, even though they had a broader theory here, what they really cared about that was humans was different. Well, the problem was that ran into the same constitutional problem. And so the Supreme Court, now, unlike before where it was unanimous, now with two folks dissenting, one of them still on the court, a Mr. Scalia, with two people dissenting, strike down these creation science laws. They picked Louisiana's, but it applied to the one in Arkansas and various other ones and various local restrictions that mandated equal time or balanced treatment for creation science along with evolution. But what you actually had is, if you looked back at that period of time, you would still see that, okay, we can't ban the teaching of evolution. We can't mandate equal time. But what surveys were taken, and most schools just didn't talk much about evolution. it wasn't official, and you would in Los Angeles, you would in Seattle, you would in New York City. But if you took a poll of all the school districts, you would find that 80% of America's school districts, because most of them are small, 80% of the school districts just didn't talk much about evolution. Virtually nothing about human evolution. They just didn't cover it. They just never had time. You know, they were too busy dissecting frogs, and they didn't get to that part. It was in the textbooks maybe, but they didn't get to it. And that sort of was how the things quieted down until this came out, called The Nation at Risk. Now, this was a report actually came out in the Reagan administration and followed through in the first Bush administration, that basically our schools were going to hell in a handbasket, and we need to have common standards. We need to have a list of things that are covered in our schools, and they have to be tested, so they actually are covered. And suddenly, from state by state, they started passing school regulations, guidelines that were adopted in every state. Every state had to do it, all 50 states. Well, they gave an exception to Iowa, but that's a special case. 49 states, they adopted school guidelines, and they had to cover all the basic issues like science and math and English and history. And the National Academy of Sciences wrote the science standards. Now, they didn't have to follow them, but they were recommended they were. And then you had to test to them. So suddenly, all the schools had to cover what were in the state standards. Now, the states could vary somewhat, but here in most states, the scientists could get involved. And so it didn't matter whether you were Kansas or Ohio or Montana, the local scientists at the local college like Kansas State or Montana State got involved in writing these standards. And suddenly you saw evolution reappear and an openness for textbooks that included evolution. I did a little listing, and by 200, every state except Iowa, of course, had adopted some form of science standards that at least addressed the topic of biological evolution, because the scientists won't exclude it. And so what we had, if you look at them though, 46 of the 49 specifically include the concept that species change over time and of natural selection, both of them. So they were going to have to cover those issues. 38 required that some evidence for evolution be covered. 21 required that descent with modification be covered. But only six required that human evolution be covered. Only 6 in the entire country. And even with those, you began having kickback, led in part by this person, Michael Behe, who was an intelligent designer, wrote books about intelligent design, which argued that certain biological functions, he stressed the flagellum in bacteria and the antifreeze characteristics in fishes in Antarctica, and a few others, could not have evolved by a random process. But what he's really concerned about is the same thing that Wallace was concerned about, that the human brain couldn't have gotten there that way. Not human emotion, not love, not those characteristics couldn't have evolved through a genetic process. And if you read what they're talking about, if you read their accounts that coming from the intelligent design people, it's human evolution where they always made their ground. This is an ad that Answers in Genesis, which is a leading program that pushes this, published in journals. I flipped open what's considered a moderate Christian magazine, Christianity Today, and one day I was flipping it over, and here was a 2-page ad from Answers in Genesis. They had the Creation Museum in Kentucky. And this is their point. If you don't matter to God, you don't matter to anyone. In a society, we are reaping the consequences of unquestioned acceptance of a belief in evolution every day. It diminishes our worth. It reduces us from being made in the image of God to being mere players in some game of survival of the fittest. Find hope, find truth, find answers today in Genesis. Again, it's the human issue that is really at the core of these battles. So where did they come up with? Well, you get the intelligent design people going before state legislatures, and where we are today is you have states like Alabama that require in the front of every textbook the word theory has many, this has to go in front of every biology textbook, only biology textbooks. The word theory has many meanings. Theory are defined as systematic, organized knowledge. And then you go down, the theory of evolution by natural selection is a controversial theory that is included in this textbook. It is controversial because it states that natural selection provides the basis for modern scientific explanations and the diversity of living things. Since natural selection has been observed to play a role in small changes in populations, it's assumed that it produces. Because of its importance and implications, students understand the nature of evolutionary theories. They have to because it's in their science guidelines. It wasn't in their textbooks before it was in their science guidelines. But they should make distinctions between multiple meanings of evolution, to distinguish between observations and assumptions, and to wrestle with the unanswered questions and unsolved problems that still face it. There are many unanswered questions about the origins of life. With the explosion of new scientific knowledge in biological and molecular biology, exciting new fossil discoveries, Alabama students may be among those who use their understanding and skills to contribute to the knowledge and answer many unanswered questions. Use critical thinking when you think about these things. Now, a second way they've gone, those are stickers, stamps put in the front of every biology textbook. They're not in front of physics textbooks. They're not in front of any other textbooks. Similarly, Louisiana has passed this law. Science, it's called the Louisiana Science Education Act. And what it says is the state board and elementary and secondary education, upon request of any city, parish, or other public school board, shall allow and assist teachers, principals, and other school administrators to create and foster an environment within public elementary and secondary schools that promotes critical thinking skills, logical analysis, and open and objective discussion of scientific theories being studied, including, but not limited to, this is all they're really focusing on, evolution, the origins of life, global warming, we don't have to worry about that in Louisiana, and human cloning. That's the law in Louisiana. Now, Tennessee, not to be updone. Tennessee, of course, was the home of the first law. Tennessee would not be updone. In 2012, they followed with their own very similar thing. Now, for them, it was biological evolution, chemical origins of life, global warming, there we are again, and human cloning can cause controversy. But there they say, where before they allow teachers to cover it, here, if you read down, they'll say the schools must cover they shall. Shall is the word. They shall cover this. They shall say that there is controversy about it. Well, I'm all about teaching critical thinking. You can ask any of my students. I love critical thinking. I think that's what schools should be all about. But the truth is, critical thinking does not mean that all criticisms are equally valid. Critical thinking has to be based on some rules of reason and evidence. And discussion of critical thinking or controversies does not mean giving weight to every idea that lacks essentials, even if those ideas lack essential supporting basis. But in those states now, and other school districts are adopting, and these are on the table in dozens and dozens of states, and likely to be passed, especially after the latest election, in many states. So this is the way where we've gotten. Now you'd think the Supreme Court would step in again. They solved the first one and they solved the second one, but Eugenie Scott, who's head of the National Science Teaching Association, who has led some of these battles, she has basically directed the forces not to sue on any of these because she suspects that an attack on either the science, these laws, or the mandated disclaimers in the front of textbooks, as in Alabama, would lose. That the current Supreme Court would uphold these, and she doesn't want that precedent. So they have never been challenged, and they remain the law. So as you see, these remain important issues both in the community, and they remain in the community because the latest poll I saw, the one that just came out a couple months ago, said that 42% of the American people believe God created humans in their present form. This was the Gallup poll that came out 2 months ago. That of the remaining 31%, not of the 42% thinks that God created humans in their present form. 31% said that humans have evolved, but with God guiding the process. And only 19% of Americans believe that humans evolved, but God had no part in the process. And it's primarily focused in the community, but Francis Collins, a very famous scientist, he's been out here to lecture. He's head of the, I think he's head of NIH now. He used to be head of the Genome Project. He has argued in very similar terms, and he argues in several books in very similar terms to Wallace, that there's certain aspects of humanity, such as love, belief in God, basically our big brain. It couldn't have evolved. It must have been created by an overarching intelligence. So this is the issue, carrying it forward today, of where this issue stands today. Thank you very much.
Hi, so we have about 5 minutes before lunch. If you have any questions for either Ed or myself, fire away and I'll repeat them. Yes, sir, go ahead.
A question for Professor Larson, and thank you both for your presentations. This is great. If Bryan's progressive politics lie at the root of his belief that evolution stops at humans, how do we explain, the opposite side of this case, and Scopes being defended by an avowed socialist who obviously had similar political beliefs?
Well, Clarence Darrow was certainly not an avowed socialist. Bryan was much more liberal than he was. Clarence Darrow was more of a libertarian. But I see your point. He was an avowed atheist. I certainly will buy that. He made no bones about that. No, it's not just his progressive politics. Bryan deeply believed in religion. He didn't believe in a literal interpretation, but he deeply believed. He was a deep and very sincere believing Christian, which makes him similar like Gladstone, William Gladstone in England, who was a prime minister who had grave doubts about Darwinism for the same reason. And in fact, he was an heir a little bit of Gladstone. But you had other conservative Christians who didn't believe in evolution. But they just left it at that. They didn't believe it, and they didn't want their churches teaching it. Okay. The progressivism in Bryan is Bryan thought there'd be legislative solutions to social problems. He believed deeply that the government could solve problems. And so naturally, when he saw a problem, it was his idea to get a law passed where the Moody Bible Institute and other groups that were on his side on this one and already invested in the anti-evolution movement before Bryan jumped on board and basically takes it over. They want to purify the churches, and his idea is to go into the high schools and have governmental laws that clean up. So that's where the progressivism comes in, but it's a mixture of his progressive politics and his religion mixed together, and it definitely takes both. It's not just one versus the other. And of course, on this, he's opposed by Woodrow Wilson on one side and President Calvin Coolidge on the other side. Coolidge was very religious, but he was also very much a social Darwinist in his thinking, and so he didn't mind it at all. And Woodrow Wilson was very religious, but a progressivist. So you get a different sort of viewpoint, but you're right. That's a good point. It certainly doesn't automatically lead there, but it's, I think, a necessary element in Bryan's case. And his arguments are based on the social consequences. And it's only when you add the social consequences to the religion that you get enough to make it a social movement that sweeps the country.
Yes, I have a question about Wallace and his strong views against vaccinations. I'm a little puzzled because at the time that he had these views was also the time when Pasteur had done his work, and one of the things he showed early on, I think the first experiments on vaccinations with anthrax, with sheep, where it was highly effective. And so my question has to do with what was the basis for Wallace objecting to vaccinations?
The side effects, and also the people that died from vaccines. And this still happens. There's still side effects and negative consequences to vaccinations today, as the anti-vaxxers will point out. They also fail to point out the tens of millions of people that have been saved by this. But that kind of data was not available in Wallace's time. It was not unreasonable to be skeptical of vaccinations, although the tide had already started turning by then. So again, I think he was on the wrong side of that debate for other reasons, but there was just enough empirical data to support his claim to make it seem reasonable, even though I don't think it really was at that time.
Did Wallace have a basis for his spiritual belief regarding, for one, spirits, ghosts? I'm asking you that because I'm a scientist, I'm a chemist. I've had a paranormal experience. When you were mentioning this, I'm thinking, something else is going on. Could you explain how he came to his ideas?
Yes, well, from a very early age, he was interested in the phrenology movement, mesmerism, the idea that there's something else, even the concept of mind. In other words, he was a dualist. Most people are natural-born dualists. They just think there's two substances, brain and mind, body and soul, corporeal and incorporeal, and he was definitely that. So once you go down that, it's easy to have experiences like you've had, I've had. Most people have had anomalous psychological experiences like this that we can't explain. So what do you do with those experiences if there's no natural explanation? The answer is you don't have to do anything with it. But most people like to fill the gap with something. And so if science doesn't have a good explanation, then the paranormal or the supernatural must be real. That's certainly where Wallace went, and it fit all the other things he believed.
And I would add to that, I think his experiences in the Amazon jungle, and I haven't studied him as much in New Guinea, with the native peoples participating in their religious experiences, were very profound for him, and he felt he touched God at some of those times, and some of them were very almost spiritual and talking to others types.
Yep. So the problem from a scientific perspective is as an explanation of something. Paranormal, supernatural type explanations fail to account for all of the events where, say, you prayed or meditated or were thinking about X and nothing happened. Because that's usually what happens, nothing. And so you just forget those, and you remember those unusual hits, the things that stand out. And we all do. It's just how the brain works. You just notice those emotionally salient, unusual events connected to you personally. But you forget all the times you were thinking about this person that passed over, or you were meditating, praying, whatever it is you were doing, and nothing happened. That in science, you have to count all of those too as part of your explanation. And so that, in my opinion, without saying that those experiences prove the paranormal or that we know for sure there is no such thing as a scientific explanation, you need a much more solid foundation.